that venue and don't have to incur the cost and uncertainty of taking something to a ballot initiative. Now, so in the superstores context, for example, I mean, there's been all sorts around California, around the country, of efforts to try to limit or block altogether Walmart from entering into local communities, and it's been initiated by labor. The OCW in particular is trying to protect grocery workers, and the proactive strategies have tended to be legislative, and then the battle has been to try to block the initiative that's brought by Walmart. So you know, you can go through the legislative process. And, you know, the Inglewood story is a really good one because there was a whole process of organizing that preceded the Inglewood legislation that basically sort of got people who were supportive of Walmart off of the local city council and put Walmart opponents on the city council in order to get the legislative bill passed. And then it's so there's sort of, I think there's been a perception at least, and I don't know if this is right or wrong, of sort of the ability to access legislative power and to advance goals through the legislative process as opposed to the initiative process. Yes, sir.
My name is Shahari Ari. I'm with a campaign called Warehouse Workers United in the Inland Empire, and it's a project of change to win. It's the reason we're here is we're actually trying to think through developing a strategy like this, and so I think our question is like, the equation you described in terms of, you know, what makes a successful campaign, a successful local project like this, entails having a local government or governmental agencies that are sympathetic, and we're trying to get there, but in a place like Riverside and San Bernardino County, that's definitely something that's lacking. So I was wondering if you had thoughts, or in your research, if you'd looked at places that didn't have that level of progressive majority in the city or county level. What if there have been attempts to do kind of proactive work like this?
You know, I haven't. I mean, the research I've done has been all about LA. So it's not. I haven't sort of systematically looked outside of LA to see sort of what alternatives have been in play in other places. So I guess part of it would depend on the kinds of strategies that you're considering implementing, and sort of, you know, what the leverage points are. In New York, which I know a little bit about from the point of view of the community benefits agreement, there have been a number of different strategies that have been employed in order to get those passed, or to get those agreements entered into in New York. That look very different than what's happening in LA, where there's been really strong support by labor, and I think New York still has a pretty progressive local government, but the labor presence, at least on the city council level, isn't as strong, and some of the community benefits agreements that have been passed have been actually pushed through with other sorts of groups that have better links to local government. Like in New York, Acorn is relatively more powerful than it is here, and they've been a really important player on the community benefits front. Now that still sort of presupposes a receptive local legislature that's going to listen to claims by progressive organizations. But so there's that as a factor. I guess the other thing is that on the community benefits front, again in New York, part of what's happened there, which has actually been quite controversial, is that there have been a number of agreements that have been entered into that have had really strong alliances between the developers and the community groups. Mm-hmm. So, you know, this cuts both ways, but to the extent that one is able to bring in allies that are not within one's sort of traditional sphere of influence. In other words, to the extent that you're sort of able to create alliances with the sort of progressive groups and the developers, you enhance the opportunities to advance particular kinds of policies. Now, in New York, that's become wildly controversial, particularly around there's a community benefits program that was entered into in connection with Atlantic Yards, which is it's going to be the new, it's not New Jersey Nets anymore, I guess it's going to be the Brooklyn Nets, the basketball team. They have a new arena that was initially supposed to be designed by Frank Gehry, but the recession hit and they didn't have money to pay him, so it's now going to be designed by some other architect. It's not going to look as beautiful, but it's right in the center of Brooklyn, and it's going to create a basketball arena with apartments and hotels and shopping. It's going to create a lot of congestion. Community groups were generally opposed to it. The community benefits agreement was struck between the developer and some community groups led by Acorn. And a lot of the progressive groups have castigated this community benefits agreement because they say it's basically legitimation for the developer to build something that most of the community doesn't want, and Acorn struck a deal. So that sort of this is sort of a cautionary tale. The positive point of it is that alliances can be entered into with non-traditional partners. The negative is that that can actually undercut sort of a broader effort to build relationships among progressive members.
Two things. I mean, I think this framework makes a lot of sense, but as you sort of broaden the field of vision, there are a bunch of cases that don't fit into the framework as you've laid it out. So there is increasingly stuff happening at the state and sometimes the federal level. So the classic example is actually living wage, where Stephanie Lutz and Paul San have an essay in the book that I edited with Netta Bernhardt and other people 2 years ago, Gloves Off the Economy, where they're saying, it went from city contractors, very much city living wages, to the same coalition winning state minimum wage increases, to when the Democrats sort of retook the House in 2006 to getting federal minimum wage increases. So that scaled up. And I think there are other examples. I mean, the obvious one is the California home care campaign, where there was a state law that sort of said the employer of record for home care workers is the state of California, because most of the reimbursement is passing through the state of California. So instead of, however many million California residents being the employers of these home care workers, it's the state of California, which then makes it possible to unionize them under U.S. labor law. Another example that's probably more relevant to your concerns is the Workplace Project in New York, which was organizing immigrant workers, particularly domestics, in Long Island, which is a fragmented jurisdiction. There's multiple municipal governments there, and ended up getting a state law passed in Albany, giving various protections to immigrant and domestic workers, and found that sort of the conducive. So it's not always local. I mean, it's a question of sort of where is the sympathetic jurisdiction. The other thing is that there have been some interesting new litigation-based strategies too. So that, I mean, in some ways, the most high-profile one is Restaurant Opportunity Center in New York, which has been a worker center, in some ways very similar to the LA model, but their key weapon and their key club has been sort of litigation over wage and hour violations. And they've used that as a tool to organize workers and to organize employers too, to basically create this sort of quasi-contractual relationship with a growing number of restaurant employers. The whole shift towards, the whole movement towards wage theft ordinances that actually criminalize underpayment of wages as opposed to just having it liable for civil penalties is another case where you're getting legislation, but the legislation then sets up the courts as a more friendly environment. Because in some ways it doesn't matter too much if you've got a conservative or a liberal court. If you've got a law that says not paying wages is a criminal violation beyond a certain amount, that's pretty cut and dry. So I just think as you sort of widen your field of vision, there's a little more variation there, which doesn't take away from the core of this model, but does modify the picture.
I think